Another thing I picked up in the book that I was surprised to learn, you know, Atlanta builds its way past the Civil War in so many ways. You have a great image of a lamppost with the remnants of a shell at the bottom being one of the only remainders of the actual fighting. And Atlanta today, if you were to go downtown, if there's a Civil War there, it's not visible because it's so built, such an urban environment. But in other ways, the fact that Sherman returns more than once to speak about the role of the siege of Atlanta and the destruction of the town, how much do they really escape the Civil War? Grady wants to say that's in the past, and yet in that period in which he was still alive, Sherman is returning to, in the period that was a popular reconciliation time between North and South, and not much long after that, Du Bois is voicing a demand for independence and respect out of Atlanta for African Americans. That seems to be difficult to ignore in that environment. Is the Civil War something they truly were able to get past?
I think, well, to start with, I think the Civil War provides a convenient vehicle for this vision of progress because it wipes the slate clean. You know, there is destruction, but at the same time you can rebuild any way you want to. It's like the geography and the psychology and the economy. So in that sense, I think they embrace the heritage of the Civil War and the destruction, the heritage of destruction. So in the case of boosters like Brady, destruction becomes part of the ethos of the city. So the city becomes the phoenix. You know, it's in the 1880s, the phoenix becomes part of the city seal, the city of Atlanta. So renewal, charging ahead, this vision of progress is connected to destruction. It's an asset. In other words, you know, in terms of people like Brady who are selling things, they're selling the city, they're selling it to investors. It's another selling point, and that becomes part of you know, the way the city identifies itself. So curious kind of thing because the city is wiping away its past at the same time it's hanging onto that one thread. And physically, you're quite right. It's physically, you know, destroying, as most places are, I think, in this era that, you know, they're plowing over. And Atlanta's a place where all over the city there are artifacts of the Civil War. You know, the Atlanta University is in the western side of the old downtown, and you know, right there in Atlanta University are entrenchments that were part of the siege of Atlanta in 1864. But so it's an interesting thing because the city wants to hang on to that as an asset, but at the same time wants to move forward and pave over the past. You know, wipe the slate clean, continue to move forward, but without being shackled by the past. I don't know if that makes sense.
I was struck that they were willing to bring the person they held most responsible for destroying it back to talk, and as you represent his returning, he's not attacked. He's welcomed and listened to. He gets a chance to speak more than once about that. Was that cathartic for Atlantans? Why would they want Sherman back?
I think Sherman comes twice, 1879 and 1881, and the only time he comes to Atlanta since he left it in 1864. And Atlantans they're not quite at the point where Sherman is Attila the Hun. That's a later development, you know, where Sherman is the Ravager.
Does that fit into the Lost Cause? Is that that's where he gets the idea that we're most familiar with him in the South as this great destroyer with no redeeming features, and so someone who knows that would be amazed to hear there he is, and they're glad to see him.
Yeah. Now Sherman is still, there's sort of a kind of an exotic quality to having this person come back, and it's also very much part of the narrative that is emerging where Atlanta is embracing the North, and Sherman himself is connected to the effort. The return of Sherman is connected to the effort to sell and to attract Northern investment in 79-81. Interestingly, Sherman comes back, the second time he comes back, 81, he comes for the exposition that Atlanta puts on, and he's feted, he's honored. There's a little kind of ironic comments that you get in the press, but he speaks. There's a meeting of, interestingly, a meeting of Mexican War veterans. So they think about war. They're not quite at the point
We're
where
not going to talk Civil
no,
War
no,
yet.
North and South.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But those two visits are very, very interesting times and moments in terms of how Atlanta's presenting itself. And this is only 15 years after he'd been there, but here he is coming back. And
well, and you mentioned the Atlanta Exposition, and here again a remarkable, famous event that is most noted now, of course, by Booker Washington making a claim that we can get along if we'll leave each other alone, and Du Bois on the other side of that eventually saying that's not the way to progress. Why would they even have Washington there? Isn't that too much of a reminder? I was fascinated to see part of the exposition that recognized there's a whole space dedicated to African American progress, not fully in their control, but that it's there is another statement of Atlanta thinking and straddling this idea of race to suggest that it's under control.
Right.
These people are okay.
Right. Well, the Atlanta Exposition of 1895 is the third of three expositions, and the late 19th century is characterized by kind of a rage, very much a fad of these new world fairs that are taking place, and they're very much part of a city announcing its importance to the rest of the world. Previously, and I talk about this in the book, but up until 1895, for the most part, black people were excluded from these expositions, including the famous Columbian Exposition in 1893.
Chicago.
That was the most successful of all of them in the late 19th century, fantastically successful. But it was criticized roundly and justly for excluding, basically, minimizing or basically excluding African American participation. So part of the way we should understand Washington's speech, his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, I think, is to see it in the context of the Black Exposition movement and this effort to increase the representation of the race, increase the presence of African Americans at these World's Fairs. There was a movement that I talk about, an attempt to have separate black World's Fairs, which at one point was seeking congressional funding. Washington was a part of that. 1895 is, the Negro Building is probably the most ambitious representation of African American achievement in late 19th century America. And Washington's speech is very much should be seen in the context of, and David Blight talks about this in his book a bit. It's a very good discussion in Race and Reunion about how Washington himself is embracing a version of the past, a version of the Civil War, and a version of black progress that is a central part of what the speech is trying to do. We often sort of decontextualize, I think, what the Atlanta Compromise was. And Du Bois, Du Bois and Washington in 1895 are close. They remain close. In fact, Washington tries to hire Du Bois over to Tuskegee.
Right.
The breach occurs later. Very important part of the story, but this particular moment, Atlanta Compromise, the Negro Building, the Exposition of 1895 are part of a kind of coming of age of this version of Black America.
Is it a way for us to understand maybe the meaning of the New South for African Americans?
Right.
It's appropriate to think of that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the African American version of progress. Progress wedded to a certain version of the past. And a past based on the end of year one, beginning with the end of slavery, and but a past with a version which is very consciously rejecting white supremacy. There's no question about that. Even Washington, for all the people criticize him for, is part of his message. If you take somebody like Henry Neal Turner, who was also he's in Atlanta too, black nationalist, AME bishop, back to Africa leader. Turner very much buys into a vision of black progress, but totally rejects white supremacy, and is outspoken much more than Washington is, and intemperate often, but very clear. clear version of what, you know, what the end of slavery meant, what the Civil War was about. The Civil War was mainly about the end of slavery and destruction of slavery, and how Black progress was associated with that. There, you know, he's another key figure that's in Atlanta. This assemblage of people that are there.